Hey guys, it's Tristan, the designer of Grave. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about horror games, specifically survival horror. Hopefully this will give you a good idea of what we're shooting for in the game, as well as let you know a few of the ways that Grave is different from your average horror title. First off, some of you may not be super familiar with the concept of survival horror. So what is it exactly? When people nowadays hear the word survival, they tend to think of eating, sleeping, and foraging. But the original meaning of survival horror was a bit different. Aside from the scary themes and monsters, classic survival horror games were defined by two major elements. Managing an inventory was necessary to progress in the game, and death actually mattered. In fact, most games limited where you could save and restart when you died, sometimes creating the potential for losing a large amount of progression if a monster got the jump on you. In addition to a really punishing difficulty, many of these games featured clumsy cameras, tank-like controls, and some really obscure puzzles. So survival horror broke off in two directions: action games with a horror skin, and horror games, mostly indie titles that focused entirely on the scare factor and are doing some really cool things. But the survival horror genre all but disappeared. Either you're a roided out superhero, or you're completely powerless and forced to run and hide. There's really no equivalent anymore to what survival horror used to do as a genre. Survival horror brought a lot of cool things to the table. First off, you always had a lot of choices when dealing with a situation. It was rare that you would be forced to engage in combat and prohibited from running away. You could make choices about which weapons you wanted to use and how often. In fact, a lot of this was really good for replay value, as you could play multiple times, emphasizing a different strategy and inventory choices. Even though the games were hard, when you died it was usually something you had some control over. You could usually retreat from a bad situation or keep a few healing items with you just in case. Even so, these games just really don't have the same traction that they used to have. So why is this? Are these games just too hard? Did we lose interest? Was it just a gimmick and we've now moved on? Well, a lot of these things are true, and there's a bunch of reasons these types of games fell into obscurity. But there's a couple key ones that I wanted to talk about here. First, survival horror games never really developed their mechanics equally in varying styles of play. If the player's choice is always between running and fighting, the game is essentially trying to convince you to cut out a section of the play experience, and one that is often more fun than the alternative. If the game doesn't have a fleshed out system that blends these strategies together organically, it can be really hard to find it interesting for very long, especially if you aren't that good at that game. Which brings us to the other major problem with the survival horror formula. It's designed for a specific, theoretical gamer that does just about everything how the designer intended them to, and who is neither too good nor too bad at the game. Sure, the game encourages choices, but the designer also has to come to conclusions about how many bullets and healing items to place in the game. It was actually possible to break your game and make it unwinnable in a lot of these classic titles, so much so that they actually warned against it in many of the manuals. It's worse than that, though. The reason is that the aggregate of many small inventory saving decisions add up, allowing you to have much more of a powerful ammo than the designers intended. Once you've gotten that good at the game, you really don't need the extra ammo anyway. You can probably even get through the majority of the game without killing anything, and this throws the game's challenge entirely out of whack. A lot of modern games have put a band-aid on this issue by adding in game directors or procedural item spawning, so the game knows how much of a resource you need and tries to give you only what you need to keep being effective. The problem with this is that it's basically a roller coaster ride, when any tight spots you might actually get into are extremely fleeting. It's faux challenge, because there's really no way to actually do it wrong. So what are we doing about this for Grave? We really wanted to give players resources to utilize throughout the game and choices to make, so we decided to look into other genres for our solution. One specifically jumped out: stealth games. Now, we're not using stealth as a main feature in Grave. What we're borrowing from stealth games is the concept of the right tool for the right job. In a game where you're supposed to be sneaking around a lot, finding a large stockpile of grenades doesn't automatically make the game easier. The grenades just aren't that useful in the majority of situations. In fact, you can be loaded up with mines, rockets, machine guns, and still not be overpowered. We're using this concept to keep the gameplay interesting and intense in Grave. Each creature you encounter reacts differently to the weapons you possess, and the encounters with these creatures are very unpredictable. In Grave, scary situations are often produced when you expect one type of creature that you have a good strategy for, but suddenly have to deal with encountering another one with different strengths and weaknesses. You won't be able to sit in a corner with your favorite weapon because not all of what is coming at you will actually react to that weapon. This will help keep the game interesting and the player engaged, and yes, it will also keep the game scary. Thanks for listening to me talk about game design for a bit, and thanks for checking out Grave. If you'd like to see more, you can view us on Kickstarter or check out these links.